This is going to be an unusual episode of Holy Hallucinations, so before I begin I'm going to take a few moments to explain how it came about. I was recently contacted by the user TheSoulEater37, who's writing a book on religion and atheism that will include contributions from such great YouTubers as DPR Jones, Proportional Response, Brett P. Palmer and Great Big Boar. Soul Eater not only asked for permission to quote me, but also whether I'd mind answering in my own YouTube style some allegedly unanswerable questions posed by a theist. Since I normally prefer to just stick to defending science, I wasn't entirely sure whether to accept such an open invitation, but in the end I agreed, and soon afterward was furnished with a list of banalities from none other than that greasy little car salesman of an apologist, Casey Luskin of the Discovery Institute of Misinformation and Downright Dishonesty. Now, some of these are questions that I'd not normally address because they're either outside my area of expertise, or not designed to discredit science, or are to do with the existence of God, who I'm not primarily here to try and disprove. However, because I didn't want to be accused of evasiveness, I decided to answer them all to the best of my ability. And since I'd taken the time to do that, I thought it would be silly not to kill two birds with one stone and use my answers as the basis of a Holy Hallucinations episode. So with all that said, let's cut to the chase and take a look at the pungent and crusty cerebral stools that our friend Casey thought would be so perplexing.
What is the origin of matter?
The currently accepted best explanation of the observable evidence, such as universal expansion, the relative abundance of hydrogen and helium, and the cosmic microwave background, is that our universe, and not only all matter and energy but also space and time, arose from the expansion of a singularity approximately 13.8 billion years ago. As to what happened before that, well, while I'm not a physicist, it's my understanding that this is an area of active research and that numerous speculative hypotheses have been proposed. At the moment, however, the only honest answer is I don't know. And anyone who says they do know, particularly if they're claiming knowledge that posits that some kind of supernatural but suspiciously ephemeral entity is responsible, is nothing more than either a self-deluded or lying bag of stale piss. Because in reality, just like the rest of us, they don't know. They're just asserting they know, or thinking wishfully, because their childish, feeble minds aren't able to grow up and accept the reality that in the big scary world not everything's certain, and that there may not be someone out there to hold your hand when you need to go poopy. The inability of science to currently explain any given phenomenon in no way lends credence to the existence of any God, either past, present, or yet to be conjured up by the minds of men. If you want to make the claim that your God is responsible, then kindly provide both empirical and verifiable evidence of his existence and the mechanisms he employed in creating matter, or admit that you have no rational grounds for this claim and are just chalking it up to magic because it's easier than thinking about it. If you won't do either, then kindly just shut up and piss off.
What is the origin of information in DNA?
Science, of course, has developed a number of hypotheses with regard to the origin of the first self-replicating polymers and produced evidence to support many aspects of these ideas. So while no definitive answer has been arrived at in this nascent but rapidly growing field of study, it is disingenuous of you in the extreme to act as if this is a completely unaddressed and seemingly intractable problem in modern biology. If you had paid attention in college and spent less time learning to chase ambulances for a living, you might have realized this and not been doomed to making yourself look like an ignorant boob in public by asking stupid questions. Of course, the other possibility is that you're well aware of concepts such as the RNA world hypothesis, ribozymes and hypercycles, but are deliberately ignoring them because you're a despicably dishonest fraud who doesn't care how big or how repugnant the lies he tells to push his agenda are, or about the consequences of pushing them. Making specific criticisms of scientific ideas and generating evidence to discredit them is one thing, but ignoring their existence entirely as evidence of only your abhorrent dishonesty. DNA doesn't contain any information in the sense that you and your fellow creationists like to refer to. It is a complex polymer built from 4 basic monomeric units that can be arranged in specific sequences to form unique structures. It is these structures that drive cellular chemical reactions in specific directions to produce other specific polymers with their own specific structures and specific functions. You're bastardizing the word information from the fact that these structures can and have been described by humans in a convenient 4-letter shorthand, It is only once these sequences have been written down by humans and stored in computers that they become what you refer to as information, but they remain what they always were, nothing more than complex chemicals with equally complex chemical properties within the context of a cell. In hindsight, it's unfortunate that scientists adopted the code analogy in the development of the fields of molecular biology and genetics using words such as information, codon, transcript, and message. Though to be fair to them, how were they to know that this technical jargon was destined to be hijacked by a disingenuous cadre of filthy shysters who would later use it to imply that such information could only be produced by an intelligent mind? And not just any mind either, but the one described in particular primitive and childishly simplistic fables written long ago by a collection of ignorant goat molesters. So now that I've explained why you're yet again being dishonest with your language, and why you're ignoring large swathes of work that provide glimpses of the answers to this question, answers rooted in observable and quantifiable phenomena, perhaps you could do us the honor of providing your alternative, Casey. And remember that if what you come up with once you've stripped away all the fancy and illusory words you use to tart it up like a cheap harlot on a street corner in the end only amounts to God did it, then that's fine. Just be prepared to accept that your alternative is rooted in primitive superstition and not modern rationality. But if you can't bring yourself to do that because you don't want to look like an ignorant asshat who prefers to place his stock in fables and not facts, then please instead provide alternatives that are both credible and testable and also some empirical evidence to support them. If you can't or won't, then I'd prefer it if you would just shut up and piss off.
How does consciousness work?
I'm starting to discern a pattern in these questions, so before I go on to give my answer, I want to build on something I said earlier. You see, all you seem to be doing so far is picking on a random physical phenomenon for which science has as yet not found a fully comprehensive explanation, and using it to imply that the only possible cause for the said phenomenon is your ephemeral, all-powerful yet curiously anthropic pal. So if the purpose of your questions is to convince people that he actually exists and is merely suffering from a terminal case of shyness, then might I suggest that you'd be much better served by doing something to demonstrate that he has an actual basis in reality and isn't just the product of the collective hallucinations of primitive barbarians. Of course, I realize that it's a lot easier to sit back on your ass and pick holes in a work in progress rather than do some actual fucking work yourself, or for that matter do anything that might even remotely be interpreted as being intellectually honest, particularly since your fellow believers have been vainly trying to produce such evidence for 2 millennia. Instead, they've presented us with nothing but a string of wishful philosophical musings that have to struggle to convince anyone with even a vaguely open mind to keep their faith, let alone convince a free thinker to adopt it. While this laziness on your part somewhat pisses me off, it doesn't do so half as much as your refusal to own up to the consequence of your inability to explain exactly how your God produced these phenomena. Because in the end of the day, the answer's magic, isn't it, Casey? I strongly suspect that you and your fellow tribesmen know exactly how stupid it would look for adults to actually come out and admit that, so that's why you avoid the word like the plague. Instead, you rubbish the work of some of the greatest minds in history to propagate your spurious claims without having the balls to come out and show the world how ludicrously childish your alternative actually is. So with that said, let's get back to the matter in hand. While I know virtually nothing about the field of cognitive neuroscience, it appears that my knowledge in this area is still infinitely greater than yours, Casey. That is to say, I know at least a little more than fuck all about it. That's because I've read at least enough to know that while a comprehensive and detailed explanation of consciousness is not yet within our grasp, the phenomenon is no longer the complete mystery that you seem to be implying it is. In fact, it seems fairly clear that consciousness is an emergent property of a highly complex arrangement of an unimaginably vast array of interacting neurons. We know this because we can consistently image the same areas of the brain humming with activity following administration of the appropriate physical or psychological stimuli. We observe that damage to specific brain areas reproducibly results in the same cognitive dysfunctions. We are able to reliably reproduce specific emotions and behaviors upon physical stimulation of specific areas of the brain, and we know of countless chemical compounds that affect a stunning myriad of emotional and neuromotor functions and understand the molecular basis of their physical modes of action. Furthermore, it's been demonstrated that consciousness itself may not at all be what our subjective experiences think it is. It's been demonstrated conclusively that the subconscious brain can make decisions up to a full 10 seconds before the mind fools itself into thinking that it was responsible. This not only suggests that our inner workings are a lot more mechanical than we give them credit for, but also casts a serious shadow over the concept of free will, that old favorite that your kind used to rationalize why your God is justified in acting like a complete dipshit. Now I realize that tards like you look upon the honest admission that there is more to learn about anything as profoundly unsatisfying and feel that your explanation, which in reality explains nothing, is somehow superior, especially if you assert it as fact with enough conviction. In this particular case, I assume that your explanation for the phenomenon of consciousness, at least in part, involves that yet again invisible and undetectable entity known as a soul. With that in mind, rather than just rubbishing the explanation that actually has some evidence to support it, why don't you stop asking stupid and disingenuous questions and instead take a stab at expounding on what a soul is, what it's made of, where we can find it, and exactly how it influences and interacts with the material world? Otherwise, please just shut up and piss off.
Why is there a universal morality?
This one's easy because there isn't one, and the only people I've ever heard claiming that a universal objective morality exists are those with a religious agenda. This seems to be done while simultaneously ignoring mountains of evidently observable and historically documented evidence that morality is a fluid and continually evolving social construct created by people. What is considered moral in one culture can be regarded as downright abhorrent in another. For example, I'd warrant, Casey, that you'd consider that cutting off someone's hand for stealing is an immoral act, but there are many on this planet with convictions as strong as yours that might disagree. I personally think that what a man does with his own John Thomas, and who he does it with, is something best left to him and the four walls, whereas many who share your beliefs would judge him a monster should he choose to use it to play hide the sausage with the Pillsbury Doughboy. And even within your own cult, Casey, you have fine Christians who think it's perfectly acceptable to murder abortion providers, while the majority of your fellow believers would condemn such actions as morally reprehensible. Historically, the Romans thought nothing of watching men slaughter each other or of feeding people to wild animals for entertainment. Nor was the rape of women by soldiers always considered off-limits, as depicted by your very own Bible and also in countless historical works of non-fiction. Even the mutilation and torture of people who had the gall not to share the beliefs of your fellow Christians was at one point not even considered to be a social faux pas, and to be honest, I suspect that there might be a few hidden amongst your ilk who secretly yearn for a return to the good old days. Of course, I suspect that you'll dismiss all these examples by claiming they just reflect the actions of imperfect men and not the will of your perfectly camouflaged moral lawgiver. I say this because I've lost count of the times I've heard the same old philosophical arguments for absolute morality from dishonest fuckers who seem to spend all their time peddling them as hard as they can, instead of actually trying to produce some evidence to support them. So rather than asserting that such transcendental morals do exist based on nothing but sophistic word games and wishful thinking, why don't you grow a pair of balls and support your claim by providing us with some credible and independently verifiable evidence for the existence of your lawgiver? Or just shut up and piss off.
If Darwinian evolution simply requires survival and reproduction, why do humans compose symphonies, write poetry, worship God, discover relativity, and sacrifice their lives for their enemies?
I can't imagine how long it took for this straw man to crawl out of the sludge that's slopping around between your ears and navigate its way through your digestive tract to freedom. But judging from the stench that accompanied it, I suspect that it was some time. I'm not sure if you should be more ashamed of yourself for producing such an unashamedly insincere question or such an extraordinarily retarded one. The evolution of adaptive intelligence was one of the primary drivers for our success as a species. Our development as social animals, however, may arguably have been equally important, for we are undoubtedly more successful in groups than we would be as individuals. Selection for altruism, which is not incidentally unique to humans, and for positive group behaviors which manifest themselves as what we now call morality, would undoubtedly have given our ancestors a competitive reproductive advantage. Intelligence, on the other hand, led us to formulate solutions to increasingly complex problems. In more primitive times, however, many natural phenomena seemed inexplicable, and so this intelligence was applied to concocting fantastic explanations in terms of what could be understood at the time, that is, by resorting to the vagaries of suspiciously anthropic gods. It may have escaped your notice, Casey, but the path of history is strewn with the desiccated corpses of countless gods and goddesses whose existence was as blindly unquestioned by their followers as the existence of yours is by you. Eventually, though, that intelligence was put to more productive use following the development and formalization of the process known as the scientific method, which only further facilitated our success as a species. This also allowed humanity to eschew spurious supernatural superstitious rationalizations in favor of explanatory and predictive utilitarian models of reality based on empirical and objective evidence, models that include Einstein's general theory of relativity. All of this can be explained in terms of Darwinian evolution, but only to those who wish to listen and understand rather than stick their heads up their arses to prevent the intrusion of anything resembling reality into their cherished fables. Just like science, music, art and literature are all side effects of the intelligence that first arose as a survival strategy on the African savanna. So if your aim is to imply that these human activities could not conceivably have arisen during biological evolution, then kindly explain specifically which parts of evolutionary theory preclude this possibility and a detailed mechanistic explanation of why. Otherwise, just shut up and piss off.
Why do so many people believe in God if evolution wired us to be logical and there is no God?
Oh, for fuck's sake, Casey. Are you serious, or are you deliberately trying to create the impression that your brain's taken a permanent vacation and left your rectum to do your thinking and talking for you? It's quite clear even from the most fleeting glances at the world around us, or failing that just the questions you've been asking, that the human race is far from wired to be logical. It's only been 400 years since we've started to systematically explain the world around us compared to the millennia of religious mumbo-jumbo that prior to that passed for knowledge. That kind of historical indoctrination takes a long time to overcome, but fortunately it does seem that growing scientific literacy is slowly eroding the prevalence of superstitious thinking that you and your kind seem to be so bent on perpetuating. Of course, all of this would be happening a lot faster if you and your fellow lying fuckers at the Discovery Institute would just shut up and piss off.
Why are atheists so obsessed with God?
I for one give not one shit for your God or anyone else's, since all the divine beings I've ever heard of seem to be quite obviously the figments of human imaginations. I'm as obsessed with gods as I am with other irrelevant fictions such as fairies, unicorns and witches. That is to say, not in the fucking least. And the simple reason is that since they're non-existent, none of these things can affect my life in any way whatsoever, and so they seldom have occasion to make me spend any time even thinking about them. The same applies to your and all other gods because they're as relevant to my life as an inflatable doll is to a eunuch's. So when it comes to the moderate theist, the kind that understands that others may not share their beliefs and have the right not to have them imposed upon them or shoved down their throats, I have little problem. If these were the only kinds of theists in the world, I've little doubt that the concept of God would seldom, if ever, cross my mind. However, when fundamentalist nutjobs start trying to tell me how to live my life based on what they believe, then the issue of God becomes relevant to me. In particular, I've become obsessed with standing up to the stupidity and dishonesty of creationists like yourself. Stupidity and dishonesty that you've done a fabulous job of demonstrating with your questions so far. I've lost all tolerance for ignorant buffoons who strut out into public and expect the insane drivel that they're spewing to be blindly accepted instead of challenged. When people like you start to spread your putrid lies, I'm going to do my very best to point out the stench and exactly where it's coming from. So if you want to know why the majority of atheists appear to be so obsessed by God, Casey, it's really quite simple. It's because smug, dishonest and wantonly ignorant little pricks like you simply refuse to shut up and piss off.
Why are atheists so unilaterally uncivil?
It should be abundantly clear from either the quite astonishing levels of disingenuousness in the questions you've been asking here, or from the unfortunate mental dysfunction that causes you to pose them, exactly why some atheists are uncivil. In addition, your very assertion that this behavior is unilateral is a perfect example of the kind of outrageously mendacious behavior that is positively guaranteed to have people lining up to call you a slimy little shitstreak of an excuse for a human being. Because while I won't deny that I have no qualms of and make no apologies for telling dishonest twats exactly what I think of them, there are of course plenty of atheists out there who have a lot more patience, respect and manners than I. Conversely, I've seen the most hateful and reprehensible behavior from hordes of theists all over the internet and on my YouTube channel, behavior that makes me look angelic by comparison and that makes the theists that engage in it look like the most wicked and vile monsters imaginable. So for you to claim that rudeness is the sole domain of the atheist is a true testament to either the magnitude of the brain defect that's responsible for your delusions, or a measure of the vastness of your disregard for both truth and decency. And on that note, now that I've answered your questions, I think it would be best all round if you just shut up and fuck off.